Hi, I am at the Museum of Early Trades and Crafts in New Hampshire. And today we are going to be talking about this curfew. Now, when I first saw this object, it wasn't labeled. It was sitting here on a shelf in our collection, and I had no idea what it was. And so when I started doing research for it, I found that there were actually several different uses for something like this. But after looking through a lot of material, it became pretty clear to me that this particular curfew is designed for use in a hearth, specifically in a brick oven like the one that we have here at the museum. So a curfew basically is a tool used by cooks for controlling fire. And this makes sense because look at the shape of this. It kind of looks like a shovel, doesn't it? It looks like they would be used to move things around, and that's exactly what they were for. Now, a curfew could be made from many different materials, including iron, steel, but also less expensive metals, such as brass and copper. And that's what this is made from. It has a wooden handle attached to a long neck, which is curved at the end to form this hook. And then the blade itself is also curved and is reinforced with these two metal strips on either side. As far as we can tell, it dates to around 1790, and that's because the style of the handle reminds us of other wooden handles that we've dated from that time period. Also, this type of curfew is reminiscent of those found in, for example, the estate of Thomas Jefferson at Monticello. And it seems likely that curfews were in common use all over the American colonies at this time. Curfews, as far as we can tell, were used primarily by cooks, both enslaved and free, in order to manage their fires, especially at the end of the day when the cooking was done. The task of a cook was never ending, and so there was always some sort of preparation going on. And the fire needed to be ready at a moment's notice to continue that work. And so, as the cook went about other tasks in the household, they would need a way to manage this fire. Sometimes, depending upon the size of the firebox and the design of the fireback, a cook might have put their pots and kettles directly on top of the hot coals. And in that case, they would use the curfew just to push those off to the side. Or another option, which is more in line with what we know about the use of this particular curfew here at the museum, is that the cook would rake all of the hot coals from the firebox into a pile and then either push them under layers of ashes, which was called banking them, or cover them with a curfew, which would then be pushed to the back wall of the hearth for the night. That meant that when morning came and the cook was ready to begin cooking once more, the embers would be raked out and the fire built up again. This saved the considerable time and effort that it would take to kindle a new fire from scratch. And that brings us back to the design of this curfew. So the hook end allowed the cook to easily rake the coals into a pile, and then they would either put them under layers of ashes or cover them with the curfew. Then the handle allowed the cook to easily push the heavy curfew back towards the wall. It was kind of like pushing a broom, if you will. When we think about the life of a cook in a household like this, it's really easy to focus on the enslaved cooks, and rightfully so, given the horrific conditions in which they worked. But remember that free women, both black and white, also did this work. And so this object is a good reminder for us to consider how all people, regardless of their status in society, accomplish tasks like cooking. I mean, think about the skill it took to control a fire so well that you could bank it or cover it and then preserve it overnight, only to retrieve it the next day and start cooking again. It's not like turning off a stove burner where you just turn a knob and the gas stops flowing. They had to judge the heat of the coals, the amount of fuel that was in the firebox, the drafts coming through the chimney, and know how much to bank or cover the fire in order for it to last. This may seem like a simple tool, but it points to a level of experience and knowledge that the cook possessed. We don't know who used this particular curfew, but I hope that we can all agree that whoever it was, they were quite skilled. In order to understand what happened here at the brick oven, it's important to realize that the space behind me is only a fragment of what would have been here in the early days. In 1794, when John and Elizabeth Wade were running their tavern, inn and brickyard, the site of the museum would have been surrounded by outbuildings that formed a U-shape. Those buildings would have contained everything from a blacksmith shop to a carpenter shop to a stable, as well as living quarters for the family and perhaps even a schoolhouse. Archaeological investigations here at the museum have uncovered the remains of some of those structures, including the kitchen wing of the main house. Unfortunately, that building burned down shortly after they moved in, just a few years after 1794. It's also important to note that while archaeology is incredibly valuable for helping us interpret the past, there are some aspects of history that it simply cannot provide. Archaeology relies upon surviving material culture. In other words, physical objects left behind by people in the past. And that means that the story that we were able to tell here, the museum, is inherently biased towards those people who had access to and could afford to make or purchase nice things. We were still able to glean a lot of information from everyday items like this curfew because they point to certain aspects of daily life. In this case, they tell us that whoever cooked in this kitchen, whether they were enslaved or free, male or female, used this very basic tool in order to manage their fire. But there was so much more to the life of a cook than managing their fire. Unfortunately, that's the story that archaeology just can't tell us. That's why it is so important to read historical accounts and learn about the lives of people in the past beyond just the material culture that they left behind. A curfew may seem like a small, simple tool, but it gives us an opportunity to think differently about the lives of people in the past. For example, when we see a pot, we usually think of it as something that hung over the fire and boiled things like soup or stew. But what about this curfew tells us about the life of a cook? What do you see when you look at this curfew? Hello and welcome to this channel where we share our passion for 18th century cooking. Today, we are going to talk about tools that are useful around the kitchen and especially those that are useful by the fireplace. I have here a tool that might look like something that a dog would chew on if left unattended. But no, this is not a toy, this is a curfew. And it is an absolutely essential tool in any well-equipped colonial kitchen. Let's get started. The first thing I want to say is that there is a lot of really great illustrations of fireplaces and the accessories that go along with them in the book The Pennsylvania German, as illustrated by Mary Elizabeth Taylor. The illustrations are done by John O'Brien and they are just beautiful. If you don't have this book, I highly recommend it. You can find it in the recommended resources. So let's get started with the curfew. So what is a curfew? Basically, it is a long-handled shovel that is used to cover up your fire at the end of the day. At the end of the day, after everything has been cooked that needs to be cooked and the fire has gotten pretty much banked down, so that it is ready to go for the next morning, then you use the curfew to cover your coals either with the ashes or with the curfew itself. There's a few different methods. We're going to go over that right now. I'm going to take off my apron. It's getting a little bit warm in here. To begin with, let me just say that there's a lot of variation in these. They can be made of brass. This one is made of copper. Some of them have a very wide blade, some are more narrow. But basically the idea is that you're gonna have a flat surface and a long handle. In this case, the handle is straight, but sometimes they do curve upwards. I think that would make it easier to kind of push it into the back wall of the fireplace. This one has a hook on the end of it, and that's meant to hang on the side of the fireplace when it's not in use. There are two main ways that people used a curfew. One way was to actually bank the coals in a pile under the ashes. And that's what's illustrated in the Taylor illustration. What I am going to do here is actually show you how to cover your coals with the curfew. Imagine that it is the end of the day, and we've then had a fire going all day long. And what you need to do is decide what you're going to do with this fire. If you were cooking breakfast, you would probably use a Dutch oven or something like that, and your fire would be pretty much down to just embers. Or if it's the middle of the day, maybe you've used your fire for cooking dinner. Maybe you've got a pie in the oven. That pie is going to keep cooking for another half hour or 45 minutes. But while it's in there, you're not going to need the fire. You're going to turn it down so that it's just glowing coals underneath your pie oven, your Dutch oven. To begin with, you're going to want to rake your fire down to one side of the hearth. I always think of this as the front of the stage. This is where the action happens. Your fire will naturally kind of build out over the entire width of your hearth, but you want to push it to one side so that you can work with it. I'm going to use my fire rake to push it over to the side. Next, you'll pull out your curfew and you're going to start scooping coals onto that curfew. You're going to scoop up the hottest coals that you can find. You don't want to put cold stuff on here. You want to get it nice and hot. And then you're going to put them on top of your fire. Now, you can see that we've piled the coals up higher than the grate, and that's exactly what you want. You want to pile them high enough that when you put your curfew on top, it's going to seal in the heat and keep the fire going overnight. Now we're going to take our poker and we're going to push the coals beneath the curfew. Now you can see that they're starting to glow orange. That means that they're hot. They're hot enough to stay lit overnight. You don't want to see any blue flames because that means that your fire is not quite hot enough to sustain itself through the night. Once the coals are spread out, you're going to take your curfew and push them to the back wall of the hearth. Depending on the design of your curfew, you may have to angle it so that it pushes the coals back behind it. In this case, it works fine to just push it straight up against the wall. You want to leave this here for the night. When morning comes, you lions come back and you lions use your fire rake to pull out the coals and get your fire started for the morning. Let's try this again with a smaller fire. Let's imagine that it's early in the morning, late in the evening, and we have a fire that's pretty much just down to embers. We're going to use the same technique to bank our fire overnight. We're going to rake it together. Now we're going to take our curfew and we're going to start piling the coals up on top of each other. The nice thing about having a really big curfew is that you can gather a lot of coals and you won't have to keep going back and forth as often. Remember, you want to get the hottest coals that you can find. Then you're going to take the curfew and you're going to push the coals to the back wall of the hearth. Again, depending on the shape of your curfew, you might have to angle it so that you can push those coals back behind the curfew. You'll know that this is working if you can see that the coals are glowing red. And then you're going to leave them there overnight. In the morning, you're going to come back and you're going to rake them out and get your fire started again. The other option is to use your curfew to directly cover the top of your fire. In that case, you would follow the same procedure of raking the coals together. The difference is that you're going to hold your curfew over the top of the fire. By holding it here, I can see that it's catching the sparks that are rising out of the fire. So you can kind of tell that it's hot enough. You're going to press it down so that the weight of the metal helps to push the coals together. If you can see that there are blue flames coming out from between the cracks of the coals and the curfew, you're going to have to wait a little bit longer until the coals get hotter before you cover them up. You're going to keep doing that until the whole surface of your fire is covered with coals. When that's happened, then you can take your curfew and push it to the back wall of the hearth. Sometimes people would push it all the way up to the chimneys so that it was resting against the damper. This would help preserve the heat and keep the fire going. And in the morning, you would simply rake out your coals and get your fire started again. It takes a little bit of practice to figure out how long to let your fire burn before you cover it, whether you're covering it with ashes or with the curfew itself. But once you get the hang of it, it's really easy. And it does save a lot of time in the morning because you don't have to get your fire started from scratch every single day. It's just that simple. In the recommended resources, I've put links to a couple of websites where you can find replicas of these curfews for sale. There's even one on Etsy, so if you're looking for a Hansel and Gretel themed kitchen accessory, look no further. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something new today. I'll see you next time. Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. This is a fireplace crane. And before we begin, please subscribe to help support us. So why is this such an important part of colonial cooking? Well, fireplaces were the heart of every home in colonial America, providing warmth and light in the winter months when it got dark early and the weather could get pretty brutal. But the hearth was also used for cooking year-round, and there were many advantages to cooking over an open flame. A disadvantage, however, was that one fire could only be used for one pot at a time, and colonial cooks usually had several dishes to prepare at once. In addition to that, having a fire burning all day wasn't always practical, and it could be hard to keep the fire at a consistent temperature. It took a lot of effort to tend a fire and make sure the flames didn't die down or become too big. Keeping the fire low was particularly tricky because it was easy for food to catch fire if the flames suddenly flared up. The fireplace crane solved these problems by allowing several pots to be suspended over the fire at once. The crane could also be extended out from the chimney and then pulled back in to keep the pots at a safe distance from the fire. This gave the cook much more control over the temperature and also allowed them to add fuel to the fire without being burned. Cranes even had special hanging chains or rods called pot hooks or trammels to lift the pots higher or lower over the fire. So with all these advantages, it's no wonder that fireplace cranes were a common sight in kitchens throughout colonial America. These cranes were typically made of iron and could be quite heavy, but they were sturdy and durable. They came in a variety of designs, from simple to more complex, depending on the wealth of the household. In fact, some colonial cranes were so intricate that they were considered works of art. While some were ornately decorated, others featured architectural elements such as Palladian or Gothic arches. The most basic version of a fireplace crane consisted of two iron bars connected by chains, creating a crossbar that spanned the opening of the fireplace. These cranes were relatively inexpensive and were found in kitchens throughout colonial America, whether the family was wealthy or poor. Wealthier households, however, could afford more elaborate fireplace cranes. These cranes typically swung outward from the chimney and could be raised or lowered using a pulley system. Having a crane that swung outward was highly desirable because it allowed the cook to check on the contents of the pots without having to stand directly in front of the fire. Imagine how dangerous that must have been during the winter months when everyone was trying to stay warm. Cooking in the kitchen probably wasn't as dangerous as standing in front of the fire while wearing a linen apron, but the heat from the fire could still cause the apron to catch fire. And believe me, you don't want to find out how flammable aprons were the hard way. And it wasn't just the cook who benefited from the crane's versatility. Cranes with swinging arms could also reach out a window, which meant that food could be cooked over the fire and served directly onto a windowsill without having to carry hot pots and dishes through the house. In addition to the basic fireplace crane, there were also cranes designed to hang from the ceiling. These freestanding cranes consisted of a large hook that was attached to a wooden beam or joist in the ceiling. A chain or rope connected the hook to a swivel, which could then hold one or more crane hooks or pot hangers. The advantage of this type of crane was that it could be moved around the room and even taken down when not in use. Some ceiling cranes even had hooks along the bottom of the arm that could be used to hang drying herbs or kitchen utensils. Now let's talk about how fireplace cranes functioned. At their simplest, the fireplace crane consisted of a crossbar that rested on 2 and 3 stones at either end. But cranes with extending arms used a series of joints and hinges to achieve their range of motion. For example, a crane with a single hinge would consist of 3 sections. The section connected to the chimney had one hinge at the center. This hinge allowed the arm to swing outward. Another hinge connected the middle section to the last section, which held the crane hooks. This second hinge allowed the crane to be raised or lowered. When the crane was fully extended, the pot hooks would sit at the end of the arm and could be raised or lowered independently of the rest of the crane. Now let's look at a crane with 2 hinges. This design would allow the crane to extend further out from the chimney and could hold more pots. The first hinge would connect the section attached to the chimney to the next section. This hinge would allow the crane to swing outward. A second hinge would be located in the middle of the crane and would allow the 2 halves of the crane to be raised or lowered independently of each other. This design allowed for greater flexibility and could accommodate a variety of pots and pans. But what about controlling the temperature of the fire? You may have noticed that all of our cranes so far haven't had any chains hanging from them. The chains were actually sold separately and were referred to as pot hooks, trammels, or cranes. These chains were attached to the crane hooks at the end of the crane arms and were used to raise and lower the pots and pans over the fire. Each chain had several links and could be adjusted to achieve the desired height. By raising the chain, the pot was raised above the fire, which reduced the temperature. Lowering the chain allowed the pot to sit closer to the fire, which increased the temperature. The chains could also be moved from side to side to distribute the heat more evenly. So as you can see, fireplace cranes were incredibly versatile pieces of equipment that could be used for a variety of cooking tasks. They were a valuable investment for any colonial cook and were essential for cooking over an open flame. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. Also be sure to check out our other videos. We'd love for you to be a part of our community. Thanks for watching. Hey everyone, welcome to this house. Today, we are going to be talking about cooking vessels. So grab yourself a cup of coffee, maybe some fresh churned butter, and let's get into it. Cooking vessels were absolutely essential to the colonial kitchen, and by around 1725, pots and pans began to be manufactured in the colonies themselves. Before that time, colonists were relying on imports from England. The cooking vessels that they did make were usually quite small because the materials and the technology needed for larger ones were not readily available. But as the colonies continued to grow, so did their manufacturing capabilities. And by the middle of the 18th century, there were several iron foundries scattered throughout the colonies capable of producing a wide range of sizes and shapes of pots and kettles. As we move through today, I want you to pay attention to the shape of the items that we talk about. Colonial Americans described their cooking vessels based largely on their shape. They referred to one type as round cotton pots, while another type was known as a kettle. And then finally, there was a third category called a pan, which had no bottom at all. Let's take a look at each of these in more detail. First, we have this lovely little black iron pot with a lid. Now, not only was the shape of the vessel important in describing it, but also the presence or absence of a lid. And this was very important in the colonial kitchen. This particular pot has straight sides and a flat bottom and comes with this wonderful little lid. Because of its lid, we can tell that it is a pot and not a kettle. And this would have been used for things like stewing and simmering liquids, slowly cooking meats, or making soups. A common size for a family might be something like this, big enough to make a nice family stew, but not so large that it would take up the entire hearth and everything would have to stop while it cooked. Iron pots like this were preferred for slow cooking because iron distributes heat more evenly and slowly than other metals such as tin or copper. It also reacts with acidic foods less than those other metals. So if you wanted to cook something like a tomato-based sauce, you would choose an iron pot. Now, this is a reproduction, but these lids often had bale handles on them. While modern reproductions like this one are usually made of metal, in the historic period, they would actually have been made of wood. In fact, many times these wooden handles were put on Dutch ovens as well. Now, a Dutch oven is basically just a heavy-duty iron pot with a lid. Many times these lids would have wooden handles attached to them. However, on very large pots, it was common for them to have a hook bale handle instead of a wooden one, so you can see this little hook. Well, when you want to put the lid on top of your pot, you could then hook the lid onto the pot like that and lift it off the hearth without having to worry about it slipping out of your hands. Next, I have this iron kettle here with a lid. Kettle is a term applied to a cooking vessel that had sloping sides and lacked a cover of its own. In order to keep the contents of a kettle from boiling over, a separate lid would have to be placed over the top of the pot. Not only does this kettle not have a lid, but you can see that the spout is quite a bit higher than our pot with the lid. And this is because the kettle was usually hung from a crane above the fire rather than resting directly on the hearth. Kettles were used for boiling water or other liquids. For example, boiling corn to make hominy or parching grains to make corn or wheat flour. This one is relatively small, so this may have been used for boiling water for tea or perhaps for a small family. Kettles came in a variety of sizes, some reaching nearly 10 gallons in volume. Just imagine how much water you could boil for a big family or for a big party. Just as with the pots, kettles were also made of iron, copper, and tin, although iron was by far the most common material. Cast iron kettles were especially popular in New England, where families could rely on the durability of the iron. And that's why I think this is such a great fit for our New England company. Our 6-quart cast iron kettle is modeled after those that would have been used in early America. Like the colonial kettle, ours has a high spout and bale handle, making it easy to hang over an open fire or on our outdoor stoves. And while it's not designed to be used on the stovetop, we love using ours to boil water for tea or to cook up delicious fall apples. So now let's take a look at this wonderful little pan here. This is basically a shallow pan with a lid. They came in a variety of sizes and they were used for frying eggs, bacon, or frying fish. They could also be used to fry bread dough, making waffles or pancakes, or even cooking up some tasty corn cakes. These are referred to in the historical records as pan, a word that originated in France. The word basically describes a flat-bottomed cooking vessel without sides or a handle. Pan were usually made of iron or tin, although occasionally copper and pewter examples have survived. Tin and copper were preferred over iron because they did not react with acidic foods and they distributed heat more quickly and evenly. We know that tin and copper were more expensive, but we also know from the historical records that people who were wealthier could afford those types of vessels and therefore they would have had them in their kitchens. Moving on, we have this wonderful little trivet that has these 3 wonderful ball feet. Trivets were used to protect hearths and tables from hot pots and kettles. These 3 ball feet are typical of trivets made during the late colonial period. Prior to this time, trivets were either square or circular. This particular trivet is not only beautiful, but it's also functional. Can you name that game show? That's right, it's a trivet. This lovely little piece dates from the 19th century, but it is made in the style of the late colonial period. If you're wondering what else can go on top of that trivet, stay tuned and I will show you. This is a very special item in my collection. This is a reproduction, but it is based on an original piece that was owned by John Hancock. I acquired this for the museum store because I thought it was a wonderful way to commemorate the items that were owned by Mr. Hancock. This item is a 2-handled pot, sometimes known as a Hancock pot or a Baylor pot. 2-handled pots were very useful because they could be set directly on the hearth. And when full, they could be carried safely from the hearth to the table. This particular one has a wonderful lid and 2 handles. You can see that the lid has a decorative pattern on top, which is quite common for Hancock pots. These patterns vary, but they often include stars and hearts. Speaking of handles, there are many kinds of handles that you can find on pots and pans. Earlier, I showed you the hook bail handle that would have been found on larger pots. Smaller pots like this one often have loop handles, which are simple loops of iron that are riveted to the side of the pot. Larger pots like this one may have strap handles, which are essentially long strips of metal folded over on themselves. Some strap handles were even hinged so that they could fold down, making the pot easier to store when it was not in use. Finally, some pots and kettles had ear handles like this. These are usually found on smaller vessels, and they are basically just pieces of metal that are bent into an L shape and attached to the side of the pot or kettle. Finally, let's take a peek inside this wonderful old brick oven. These ovens were huge and extremely heavy, and they could reach temperatures of nearly 600 degrees. They were used to bake breads, pies, and whole roasted animals. They were usually built into the side of a house and could be heated from the remains of a fire built inside the oven the previous night. When the oven was heated during the day, the family could bake a loaf of bread or a pie. Then at night, the fire could be built again, making the oven hot enough to roast a pig or other large animal. And then that heat could be used again the following morning to bake more bread. These ovens required a chimney, so they were usually built outside. However, in areas where fuel and space were limited, it wasn't uncommon to find small brick ovens built inside the home. Thank you so much for joining us in the kitchen today. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about colonial cooking vessels. I would also like to say a special thank you to our curator for helping me with the research for this video, and I'll see you next time. This is your host. Today, we're going to be talking about some of the tools that our colonial cooks would have used in their kitchens. Now, if you're a person who likes to cook, you probably have a lot of specialized tools for certain tasks in your kitchen. You might have a special gadget for making pie crust, or maybe a pizza stone or baking sheet that you use all the time. Well, back in the days of our colonial ancestors, they would have had tools like that too. And some of them were quite ingenious, So let's talk about those today. One of the things that we take for granted today is the way that we buy our sugar. We can go into the grocery store and buy it in a box, in a bag, granulated, powdered, whatever form that we need. But back in the colonial period, sugar actually came in a cone shape. That's right, it would come in these large hardened cones. And our job would be to get the sugar out of it. Well, to do that, they invented something called a sugar nipper. It looks kind of like a lobster claw or a crab claw. It has two pincers that you squeeze together, and then you could pull it apart and it would break off small pieces from the cone. And the way that this works is really quite ingenious, because if you look at the sugar nipper, each one of those little holes where the sugar would come out, they're not very big, but when you hold it up to your mouth, it fits perfectly around the tip of your thumb. So what you would do is you would put the sugar nipper in your hand, squeeze it closed, bring it up to your mouth, and pop the piece of sugar into your mouth and eat it raw. Either that or you would take it and you would dissolve it in your mouth, and then you would spit it out into a dish. It's kind of disgusting to think about now, but that was how it was done. Now we don't have a lot of examples of these sugar nippers that have survived to us. Most of the examples that we do have are made out of pewter. This one is made out of copper and brass, and here you can see the two prongs. And when you pull it apart, there's a little spring inside. That's how you know that this is a sugar nipper. If you look on the back side of it, you can see where it's smooth. That was the part that would fit into your mouth. They also made them out of wood, but unfortunately none of those have survived. The other thing that you would have needed if you were preparing food in the 1700s is some sort of cutting tool. And again, they didn't have things like we do today. You know, we might have a paring knife, we might have shears, we might have regular kitchen scissors. But back then they had something called a colonial chopper. And the nice thing about this particular tool is that it still exists today. So if you'd like to own one, you could probably find one pretty easily online. Here is a modern example of a kitchen chopper. And you can see that it has a central handle, and then there are 7 blades that radiate out from that handle like the spokes of a wheel. And what happens is if you press this down onto a cutting board, so that all of the blades are flat against the cutting board, and then you rock it back and forth, it chops whatever you're cutting very finely. So imagine if you will that you've got some parsley or some sage or some other herb that you want to chop up real fine, or maybe you want to mince up some garlic or some ginger. All you would do is take your chopper, place it on the cutting board and start rocking it back and forth. This would save you a lot of time instead of having to use your knife and do it by hand. Now the downside to this is that you couldn't cut individual pieces out of something. So maybe you didn't want to cut up an apple into 12 different pieces. You could do that with a knife, but you couldn't necessarily do that with the chopper. But it was great for chopping up lots of different herbs at once and mincing them into a kind of a paste-like consistency. So let's take a look at another one of these choppers and see what's interesting about it. This is an iron chopper. It's the only metal one that I've ever seen. And you can tell that it's been sharpened over and over again, because if you look at these edges, they're not perfectly straight anymore, they're actually concave. You can tell also on the handle here, it says the patent date, 1832, even though this is a colonial chopper, so this would have been made in the 1700s. They continued to make these well into the 1800s. And you can see on this one, the handles are made out of wood, and then the blades are made out of iron. Now, if you look at this, you can see that there are 7 blades here, just like the other one. But if you turn it around and you look on the other side, there are 4 more blades. So this one has 11 blades, and it's possible that the number of blades varied from chopper to chopper. If you have a large family or you're serving a lot of people, you might want to have a chopper that has more blades so that you can cut up more food at once. This one is a much larger size than the other one that I showed you before. And it also has a little indentation here, so if you wanted to hang it up, you could. You would just stick it into a wooden pegboard or something like that. Unfortunately, these are very expensive. This one sold for $1,600. So unless you're a millionaire, you probably won't be picking one of these up anytime soon. I hope you enjoyed learning about a few of the kitchen tools that would have been used during the colonial period. And if you'd like to learn more about life in the 1700s, please be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out on any of our future videos. And until next time, remember, history is full of treasures. If you've ever written with a quill pen, you know how unique and personal the experience can be. And if you've never had that experience, well, today is your lucky day. In this video, we're going to look at one of the most important tools used in colonial America, the humble quill. Hello, and welcome to this channel, where we bring history to life through the people, places, and things that made it. Today, we are talking about writing implements and more specifically the quill. And yes, we know there's some debate about whether the quill was invented before or during colonial times. But since they were so popular and prevalent during the period, we think it deserves some attention. So what exactly was a quill? Well, simply put, it was a pen. And like other pens, it was used for writing, creating records, and even art. Unlike modern pens, however, quills were not manufactured objects. They were handmade from the feathers of birds, typically goose, swan, or turkey feathers, though any large flightless bird would do. When selecting a feather for its length, flexibility, and loftiness, these qualities would all affect the way the pen worked and the look of the final product. For example, longer feathers made for longer, thinner lines, while shorter feathers resulted in shorter, thicker lines. Because each pen was unique, its owner might develop a particular style of writing with his or her own tools. And those tools were always changing as the pen wore down and needed to be trimmed or mended. But before a feather could be used as a pen, it needed to go through a curing process. This would make the feather more flexible and help the tip keep its shape after repeated wetting. To cure feather, it first needed to be removed from the bird as close to the body as possible. The remaining quill or hollow tube that connects the feather to the bird would then be removed and discarded. Next, the feather was placed in a container filled with a solution of water and alum, which is a naturally occurring mineral compound. This mixture would help preserve the feather and remove any oils or grease that could interfere with the curing process. After being submerged for several days, the feathers were removed and laid flat to dry. Once dry, they would be ready for shaping. This next step would require a sharp knife and a steady hand, along with some knowledge of the inner structure of the feather. Each feather has two distinct parts, the upper part or the calamus, which is where the feather attaches to the bird, and the lower part, or the rachis, which is the central shaft that supports the feather's web. The purpose of this step was to cut away all but the necessary parts of the feather and turn the rachis into a usable writing point. First, the workers would cut off the base of the calamus, then carefully slice the side of the rachis, being careful not to cut too deep. It was at this point that the pen maker would decide the length of the pen. From there, the worker would cut away the excess shaft and shape the tip of the pen to create a sharper point. Then the cut feathers would be left out in the sun to dry. As the last step in making a quill, the pen would need to be sanded and polished until smooth. This could be done by rubbing the pen against a rough surface like brick or stone. Once completed, the feather should be flexible and able to hold ink without leaking. It could now be used for writing. Now that our feather is prepped and ready to go, let's talk about how to actually use a quill. First, the user would need to find a sturdy holder, something that would keep the pen secure while allowing for easy maneuverability. Early European settlers adopted a style of pen holder that was popular in 15th century France. It consisted of two pieces of wood, one that held the pen upright and another that rested on the table to stabilize the holder. These would come together to form a simple, effective writing tool. In time, variations of the pen holder would appear, including ones made entirely of metal. When ready to write, the user would take the quill and dip it into an ink bottle. Ink in colonial America was typically made from black or brown iron oxide mixed with a gum arabic, a natural adhesive substance derived from the sap of certain trees. These inks were then combined with water to form a thick paste-like consistency that was perfect for writing. As a final preparation step, the user may choose to wrap the end of the pen in cloth or tissue to create a reservoir for the ink. Now the pen is ready to use. The writer would grip the pen firmly between thumb and forefinger with the rest of the fingers curled around the pen holder. Holding the pen at an angle, the writer could now form letters, words, and sentences on the page. As the pen wore down from use, the writer may choose to trim or mend their pen to create a new writing point. The importance of quill pens in colonial America cannot be overstated. Pens were essential tools for record-keeping, communication, and conducting business. During the colonial period, literacy rates were relatively high and many colonists kept personal journals or wrote correspondence. Quill pens were also used by scribes who recorded important documents and legal agreements. In addition, merchants and traders relied on quill pens to keep track of their inventories and financial records. The use of quill pens extended beyond the realm of writing. They were also used for artwork and even musical instruments. Some colonists created beautiful works of art by etching or engraving designs onto feathers using quill pens. Additionally, the feathers from turkey and other large birds were sometimes used to make flutes and other wind instruments. Today, quill pens serve more as a reminder of a bygone era than a practical writing instrument. However, during the colonial period, they were an indispensable tool for those seeking to communicate, record important information, or create beautiful works of art. To learn more about the everyday objects that shaped our past, be sure to subscribe to this channel. If you'd like to learn more about the art of pen making, we recommend checking out a video called Making History with David Pictou. It covers the process of turning feathers into quills in great detail. And if you want to try your hand at it, we have a link to the full transcript of that video in the description below. Thanks for joining us as we explore the world that shaped our past and continues to inspire today. We'll see you next time. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending upon where you are in the world. This is your host from the James Monroe Institute, and welcome to another edition of A Minute with Monroe. We've done quite a few episodes about clothing, but today we're going to focus in on personal accessories. Personal accessories. I have here a book called The Gentleman's Fashionable and Complete Dresser. And I want you to pay attention to the cover art. Look at all of these accessories that a gentleman would have carried with him. And this is not just the essentials. This is an accumulation of all of these things he would have taken with him over the course of a day when he went out in public. And so I thought it would be fun to do a minute focusing on some of these accessories. I'm not going to cover all of them because there's too many, but we'll talk about a couple of them. Now, one of the first things I want to show you is this illustration. What you're looking at is a man who is dressing himself. And look how many accessories he has laid out around him. And he's got, of course, his hat and his cane and his handkerchief, all the things that are common sense that you would need if you're going out in public. But look at all of these other things that he has there. He has a pair of gloves. So gloves were something that people of the era wore not only to keep their hands warm, but also to maintain their appearance. It was very important in the 1800s to wear gloves when you went out in public, especially gentlemen. You wouldn't go out without your gloves. If you did, you were considered rather crass and uncouth, much like the fellow who goes through life without a shirt on his back. That is to say, you were considered poorly dressed if you didn't wear gloves. Gloves were a sign of the civilized man. So he has his pair of gloves there, but look at all the other things he has next to him. He has a cravat. Now, what's a cravat? Well, it's essentially a large piece of linen that could be worn either around the neck or even around the head. It was very fashionable to wear a cravat, and you could even wear it tied in different ways to make yourself appear taller or shorter, depending upon how you tied it. There's all kinds of instructions about how to tie your cravat, and people experimented with this quite a bit. So our fellow dandy here is getting ready to go out in public. He has his cravat there. Of course, he has his purse. In this particular illustration, It looks as though his purse is made of leather. Leather purses were quite popular among gentlemen. They might have been made of a little bit finer material, maybe Morocco leather or something like that. And it would have been something that you would carry not only your money in, but perhaps some small items as well. It wasn't uncommon for men to carry handkerchiefs and things like that in their purses or women's purses as well. And it would have been a place that you kept all of your valuables when you went out in public. So the purse is something that you always took with you when you left the house. I think we can safely assume that he has his pocket watch in there as well, and then, of course, he has a toothpick. The toothpick is a rather crude accessory, but nonetheless, it's one that people carried with them. Not every gentleman carried a toothpick, but it was becoming increasingly popular during this period. And there's a whole literature on the toothpick that tells us how people are supposed to use it, and it's almost a symbol of masculinity. And then, of course, he has his handkerchief, which is something that every gentleman would have carried. You would use your handkerchief for everything, not only to blow your nose, but even to wipe the plates off before you sat down at the table. You would take your handkerchief with you everywhere you went, and you would certainly take it with you to church. You would take it with you to the theater. You would take it with you to visit your sweetheart. You would take your handkerchief with you, and it was a part of your everyday attire. Then, of course, he has his umbrella. The umbrella is a very practical thing to carry, especially if you live in a city like London or Paris, where it rains a lot. But the umbrella is also an accessory that becomes a symbol of fashionability. To carry an umbrella was to be a fashionable person, and everybody wanted to carry the latest styles of umbrellas. Men and women carried umbrellas. They would have umbrellas specifically for wet weather. They would have umbrellas specifically for sunny days. And you could tell by the color of the umbrella what its purpose was. So our dandy here has his umbrella. He has his walking stick, of course, and he has a cane. A cane was more than just a walking stick. It was a symbol of authority. To be able to walk with a cane showed that you had arrived in life. It showed that you were somebody important, and the cane was more than just a simple walking stick. It could be used to strike somebody who deserved it. And it was usually a silent message that you sent somebody when you hit them with a cane. It was never done in public, but if you were walking down the street and somebody insulted you, you could turn around, pull up your cane and wrap them upside the head. And that would send a message that you didn't appreciate what they had just said. The cane was a very serious accessory. It wasn't just a tool to help you walk, it was something that you used to defend yourself. It was a weapon, and it was something that you used to express your displeasure. And of course, if you were a dandy, you wanted to have the finest cane. And that meant you had to have something that was made of a superior wood, maybe even an exotic wood. Maybe it was a cane that came from India or China, or maybe it had a silver handle. All kinds of canes were fashionable during this period. And having the latest fashion was something that was really important to gentlemen. But let's move away from the illustration now and talk about a couple of artifacts. Here's a pair of kid gloves. These are probably from the early 1800s, and notice how soft and supple they are. And look at how thin they are. These are very thin gloves. And you wear these when you went out in public. They're not just thick work gloves. These are fine gloves that you'd wear to church, that you'd wear to the theater, that you'd wear when you visited your sweetheart, and they were a sign of fashionability. Here's a leather purse. And this is exactly the kind of purse that would have been used by a gentleman. It's made of leather. It's a little bit smaller than a modern-day briefcase, but not that much. It's big enough to hold all of your books, all of your papers, all of your writing implements. And it's a very durable bag. It would last a long time. And then, of course, we have a crutch here. This is a silk crutch. It's from the early 1800s, and you'd use this around your neck. You could even use it around your head, and it was a sign of fashionability. If you were a real dandy, you'd make sure that your cravat was always tied just right. So the next time you go out in public, I want you to pay attention to the accessories that people carry with them. Some of them may be very mundane, but some of them may be signs of fashionability. Some of them may be signs of wealth, and some of them may just be signs that somebody is trying to make a statement. So pay attention to the accessories that people carry with them. It tells us a great deal about them as individuals. Next time, we're going to talk about sealing wax and wafers. We're going to talk about how these things were used before gummed envelopes came along. And it's a fascinating little subject, and I hope you enjoy it. Thanks for joining me today. I'm the host. This is the James Monroe Institute, and we hope you'll subscribe to our channel and join us every Wednesday for a new video. The chatelaine was a popular accessory during the 18th century. It was worn by men and women, and it was used to carry small items such as keys or a watch. The word chatelaine comes from the French word for female head of a household, chatelaine. In fact, the earliest chatelaines were designed specifically for women. They were attached to belts or bodices and could hold items such as smelling salts, a fan, a handkerchief, or even a small pistol. During the 17th century, chatelaines fell out of style somewhat, only to re-emerge later as the personal tool belt of colonial America. So in this video, we are going to look at a selection of chatelaine tools in the Denver Art Museum collection to see what life was like for our early American ancestors. Men's chatelaines typically consisted of a belt clip attached to a chain or cord that hung down to a cluster of small tools. The chatelaines in the Denver Art Museum collection exemplify this style, and each one is unique in terms of the tools it displays and their intended use. Some of these chatelaines may have been made by silversmiths who specialized in creating men's accessories, while others may have been made by individuals who were part of the trade. A good example is this chatelaine, which has a very simple design, yet it would have been quite useful for any man on the go. Made around 1770, this piece consists of a silver belt clip attached to a leather strap that hangs down to a cluster of four tools. The first tool is a pair of scissors, which would have been useful for cutting paper, cloth, or even hair. Scissors were a common tool to include on a chatelaine as they were small enough to be easily carried around, and their uses were vast. Next to the scissors is a small silver probe or toothpick, which would have been used for cleaning teeth and removing food particles. This particular toothpick has a heart-shaped head and small holes near the top, suggesting that it may have also been used as a match striker. The third tool is a small silver knife, which would have been useful for a variety of tasks such as spreading butter, opening letters, or even self-defense. Finally, the fourth tool is a small silver fork, which would have been used for eating or for styling one's hair. The simplicity and practicality of this chatelaine makes it an excellent example of the type of accessory that would have been popular in colonial America. In contrast to the previous chatelaine, this next one is more elaborate in its design and tools. Dating back to around 1790, this chatelaine consists of a silver belt clip attached to a chain that hangs down to a cluster of 6 tools. The first tool is a pair of tweezers, which would have been used for plucking eyebrows or removing hairs. Next is a small silver knife, which, as we mentioned earlier, would have had many uses. Following that is a small silver fork, which again would have been used for both eating and grooming. The fifth tool is a toothpick, similar to the one on the first chatelaine, except this one has a round head. And finally, the sixth tool is a small silver thimble, which would have been used to protect the fingers while sewing. Unlike the first chatelaine, this one includes no scissors, perhaps because they were considered too large or bulky to be included on a chatelaine. Instead, the tweezers, knife, fork, and toothpick could all serve as grooming tools as well, making this chatelaine more versatile for personal care. This next chatelaine dates to around 1760 and is crafted from a mix of materials including silver, ivory, bone, and brass. It is also the most elaborate and expensive item in the museum's collection of chatelaines, valued at $22,000. When looking at the tools, we can see the attention to detail and craftsmanship that went into creating this piece. For instance, the ivory handles of the scissors are beautifully carved and polished, while the brass blade is sharp and well honed. Similarly, the handles of the folding knife are crafted from a different type of wood, which provides a nice contrast in color and texture to the ivory. Overall, this chatelaine is not only a testament to the skill of the craftsman, but also to the popularity and importance of these accessories during the colonial period. These three chatelaines offer a glimpse into the daily lives of colonial Americans and the type of tools and accessories they carried with them. But there is another chatelaine in the Denver Art Museum's collection that stands out among the rest. It is smaller and more delicate than the others, and it does not have a traditional cluster of tools hanging from it. Instead, it features a single ornament, a gold and emerald pig. The pig would have been used for cleaning ears or fingernails, and it is beautifully crafted with intricate details and high-quality materials. The first thing that stands out about this pig is the handle. It is made from a single piece of gold, which has been shaped into a teardrop form. The gold is not just simple or plain, however. It has been engraved with delicate floral patterns and small gemstones have been set into the surface. These details demonstrate the skill and precision of the goldsmith who created the pick, as well as the importance and value placed on this simple grooming tool. But the real standout feature of this pick is the head. It is made from a single emerald, which is surrounded by smaller diamonds and pearls. The emerald is a beautiful green color and has been cut and polished to a high shine. It is surrounded by a thin gold border that contrasts nicely with the dark green of the gemstone. This combination of gold and emerald is not only visually appealing, but also symbolizes wealth and luxury. Emeralds were considered a precious gemstone, and the inclusion of one in a simple grooming tool like a pick shows the extravagance and opulence of the time period. The pick itself is small and delicate, which is typical of the chatelaines that were popular in colonial America. However, it is the quality of the materials and the attention to detail that sets it apart. The use of gold and emerald in particular speaks to the wealth and status of the person who owned it. This individual would have been someone of importance, likely a member of the elite class who could afford such a luxurious accessory. When considering the function of the pick, it is interesting to think about the social context in which it was used. A pick was a practical tool for grooming, but it was also a symbol of wealth and power. The owner of this pick would have likely used it in private, perhaps while dressing or preparing for a social event. It would have been a way to display their status and wealth without being too ostentatious or drawing unwanted attention. The pick would have been attached to a chatelaine, which was a belt or chain used to carry small items. The chatelaine would have been made from precious metals like silver or gold and would have been decorated with jewels or other embellishments. The pick would have been just one of many tools on the chatelaine, which may have also included scissors, a knife, and a fork. Overall, the gold and emerald pick is a fascinating artifact that provides a glimpse into the world of the colonial elite. It is a beautiful example of 18th century craftsmanship and a reminder of the opulence and extravagance of the time period. The pick is also a symbol of the complexities of the colonial era, a time when great wealth and extreme poverty often existed side by side. While many colonists lived in relative poverty, a small number of people enjoyed a lifestyle of luxury and privilege. The gold and emerald pick is a tangible reminder of that reality. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new about the tools and accessories used by colonial Americans. Please let me know your thoughts about chatelaines and what other topics you would like me to cover in future videos. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today we are going to talk about women's clothing during the colonial period. Please note that when I say women's clothing, I mean clothing for women and girls. So this is not a very good representation of clothing worn by men. The first thing I want to bring your attention to is the title of today's video. It's not called women's clothing. It is called colonial women's clothing because we are talking about women who lived in North America between 1620 and 1776. And these women would have worn clothing that was fashionable at that time in England. So what was that like? When we think of colonial women's clothing, We usually picture women wearing long dresses. Well, that wasn't really the case unless they were going to a party. When they were going about their daily business, colonial women wore outfits consisting of two separate pieces. They wore a short gown, which was basically a shirt, and a petticoat, which was a skirt. Now, you might be thinking that's very impractical, having two separate pieces. How do you keep them together? Well, the short gown had sleeves and the neckline was fairly high. And then the woman would put on her petticoat over her skirt, and then she would tie everything together at the waist with a belt or a ribbon. Some historians estimate that a woman could get dressed in about 5 minutes once she got used to it. She wouldn't have to deal with things like buttons or laces or zippers, only ties, so it was probably pretty easy. These two garments could be made out of linen or cotton, but more affluent women might choose to wear wool or silk. Often these two pieces would be made out of the same fabric. This outfit would have been perfectly acceptable for a woman to wear just about anywhere. If she needed to go somewhere fancier, she would just change into a different outfit. Sometimes she might wear something called a French hood, which was a fancy hat that came down over her ears. Or she might wear jewelry or perhaps a different color or a different style of dress. It's important to remember that colonial women did not have dedicated underwear like we have today. So if it was hot outside, these multiple layers of clothing could make a woman pretty hot. However, the climate in which a woman lived would determine how many layers she wore. For example, women living in the southern colonies would have worn fewer layers than women living in New England. Also, women who lived near the coast tended to wear lighter colors and fabrics than those who lived further inland. The clothing that colonial women wore balanced practicality with the prevailing styles of the day. During the early colonial period, meaning roughly between 1620 and 1700, women wore square neck dresses and aprons, and they were usually made out of linen. Starting around 1700 and continuing into the mid-1700s, women began wearing round neck dresses, meaning that the neckline curved rather than was straight across. And the apron became less necessary. A woman's clothing also said something about her social status. Wealthier women could afford more elaborate clothing, and therefore their clothing would be more expensive looking. For example, a wealthy woman might wear clothing made out of finer materials, such as silk or velvet. Her clothing would also likely be more colorful since dyes were expensive, and therefore only the wealthy could afford them. Clothing for upper-class women was often made by paid seamstresses, while middle and lower-class women made their own clothing as well as the clothing for other members of their family. Now let us take a look at some clothing terms used during the colonial period so you can better understand the clothing worn by colonial women. As I mentioned before, the main piece of clothing worn by colonial women was the short gown. This was essentially a woman's shirt. Early shirt gowns had square necks, meaning the neckline was straight across. Later, the short gown's neckline would curve more closely to the shape of a woman's chest, thus creating a more feminine silhouette. These shirt gowns were usually full length, reaching all the way to a woman's feet. They were made out of linen, cotton, wool, or silk. In general, the fabric for the body of the dress would be a plain weave, whereas the sleeves would be made out of a fancier weave such as a brocade or a damask. The short gown was fastened with ties either at the waist or at the side. Some shirt gowns could be tied in the front, but most were tied in the back, where a woman would likely need help from another person to fasten the ties. These gowns were usually sleeveless, but sometimes they had fairly large, billowing sleeves. The amount of fullness in these sleeves could be created by pleating the fabric or by inserting something called a puff. A puff was a round object, sometimes made out of padding or cloth, that would be inserted into a sleeve to make it fuller. These puffs were popular starting around 1730 and continued to be popular until the end of the colonial period. Some shirt gowns even had two puffs per sleeve, one for extra fullness and one to fit under the arm. These shirt gowns were often quite simple in appearance, especially those made out of linen, but they could also be quite fancy. For example, A woman's short gown might feature decorative stitching along the neck or down the front opening. Many short gowns also featured some sort of trim along the bottom of the skirt. Decorative trim could also be found on the cuffs of a short gown sleeves. Trims could be made out of lace, ribbon, braid, or even something as fancy as gold or silver thread. Very wealthy women might even wear clothing that had been embroidered by machine. Embroideries could feature floral patterns or even coats of arms for wealthy families. Paired with the short gown was the petticoat. The petticoat was essentially a skirt. Like the short gown, the petticoat could be made out of almost any material. During the early colonial period, these petticoats were usually made out of linen, whereas later on, wool became more popular. Petticoats were usually made with a very plain weave, unlike the short gown, which often featured more interesting weaves. These skirts could be fastened with ties at the waist, and some could even be pulled up like a bag. Some colonial women wore multiple petticoats at once, and each petticoat had a different purpose. One petticoat might have been made out of a heavy fabric such as wool, and it would be used during the winter months. Another petticoat might have been made out of a lighter fabric such as linen, and it would be used during the summer. This way, a woman could change her petticoats depending upon the season. Other clothing worn by colonial women included shifts, which were worn next to the skin. Aprons, which were usually made out of linen, were worn to protect a woman's dress from getting dirty. And mob caps, which were simple hats made out of linen that were worn indoors. I hope you enjoyed learning about clothing worn by colonial women. Remember that these women were not just objects or mannequins wearing old-fashioned clothing. These were real people who got dressed every morning and went about their lives. Many of these women were wives and mothers, and they likely made clothing for themselves and their children. They were seamstresses and they likely made a lot of clothing by hand. They might have sewn clothing for men in their family, as well as for themselves and their daughters. So the next time you look at a colonial woman's outfit, remember that these were everyday objects worn by real people who lived hundreds of years ago. Thanks for watching. Remember to share, like, and subscribe. And we'll see you next time. Imagine for a moment what your day would be like without the use of forks, plates, or cups. Well, this was everyday life for the average colonist during the 1700s. Welcome back to my channel. Today, we're going to take a closer look at the daily lives of colonial Americans by exploring 10 everyday objects that played a significant role in their lives. Make sure to stick around until the end where we lines discover how some of these ordinary items could indicate one's wealth and social standing. No. 10. The mortar and pestle. Before the days of pre-ground spices, the mortar and pestle were essential tools in any colonial kitchen. These two items were used for grinding various ingredients, such as peppercorns, herbs, and other spices. They were often made from durable materials like wood, stone, or metal, reflecting the practical and functional approach to daily life that characterized colonial America. The mortar and pestle were employed not just for their intended purpose, but also for other tasks like crushing bones for broth or mashing potatoes. They represent a time when food preparation was a labor-intensive process requiring physical effort and specialized tools. Number 9. The candle. In the dimly lit world of colonial America, candles were more than just sources of illumination. They were symbols of comfort and functionality in an era when darkness posed real challenges. Candles were crafted from materials like beeswax, tallow, or spermaceti, a substance derived from sperm whale oil. Their creation was a meticulous process involving careful melting, filtering, and pouring. The wicks were typically made from braided cotton or hemp, providing a simple yet effective way to control the flame. Beyond their practical use, candles added a touch of warmth and ambience to homes and businesses. They played a role in social gatherings, allowing people to see each other's faces, and illuminated books and documents for reading or writing. The flickering glow of candlelight fostered a sense of intimacy and created an inviting atmosphere in the evenings. For the colonists, these simple candles represented ingenuity, resourcefulness, and the desire to brighten the darkness of daily life. Number 8. The pocket watch. Before the advent of smartphones and digital clocks, pocket watches were the go-to timekeeping devices. Introduced to the Americas by European settlers, these portable timepieces were not only functional, but also reflected the growing influence of technology in colonial society. Initially, pocket watches were primarily used by merchants, government officials, and the wealthy elite due to their high cost. However, as time went on, they became more accessible to the general population. These watches were typically made of brass or silver and featured intricate mechanisms. They were often carried in a pocket or attached to a chain or fob, hence the name pocket watch. The invention of more affordable pocket watches helped to standardize timekeeping in colonial America, facilitating trade, travel, and daily life. The ticking of a pocket watch became a familiar sound, marking the passage of time in a world without readily available clocks. Number 7. The tankard. The tankard held a prominent place in the social and domestic life of colonial America. These sturdy drinking vessels were typically made of wood, pewter, or tin-coated iron and were designed to hold beer, cider, ale, or water. The tankard's construction often featured a simple yet elegant design with a cylindrical body, a lid, and a handle. They were not only functional, but also symbolized hospitality and community. Tavern tankards, often made of wood, were large enough to be passed around, allowing padrones to share drinks in a communal setting. Tankards were also used in everyday life, featuring prominently in family gatherings and social events. The act of passing a tankard was a gesture of sharing and camaraderie, and the tankard itself served as a symbol of the importance of community and togetherness in colonial society. 6. The spinning wheel. The spinning wheel was an indispensable tool in the daily lives of colonial women. This device, brought to the Americas by European immigrants, played a pivotal role in the production of textiles. Before the advent of industrialization, clothing was primarily made by hand. The spinning wheel enabled women to transform raw materials like cotton, flax, or wool into usable thread and fabric. This simple yet ingenious machine consisted of a wheel, a spindle, and a hand-operated mechanism. As the wheel was spun, it drew out the fibers, creating a continuous thread. Women gathered around spinning wheels in homes and community spaces, creating a social atmosphere while producing the materials for their clothing and household goods. The spinning wheel symbolized the vital role women played in colonial economies and the importance of textile production in daily life. It was an emblem of self-sufficiency, resourcefulness, and the interconnectedness of women in colonial society. Number 5. The writing quill. In the realm of colonial America, the writing quill was more than just a pen. It was a tool for communication, record-keeping, and the exchange of ideas. These quills, typically crafted from goose or swan feathers, were meticulously selected for their flexibility and quality. The writing quill played a crucial role in shaping colonial society. Through them, colonists kept detailed journals documenting their experiences and observations. They communicated with each other through letters, discussing important matters, sharing news, and expressing personal sentiments. The writing quill facilitated the exchange of knowledge and ideas, helping to foster intellectual discourse and the spread of information. Moreover, the quill was instrumental in the realm of business and governance. Merchants used them to record transactions, while government officials employed them to draft laws, proclamations, and official correspondence. 4. The fireback. The humble fireback, a simple yet essential item in colonial homes. These metal plates, typically made of iron or steel, were designed to be placed at the back of fireplaces. Functionally, firebacks served an important purpose. They helped contain the heat from fireplaces, protecting the wooden structures behind them. This was particularly crucial in colonial homes where fireplaces were central to heating and cooking. Beyond their practical use, firebacks often featured decorative designs or served as a canvas for showcasing one's identity or beliefs. Some firebacks displayed coats of arms or family crests, indicating the owner's lineage or social standing. Others have biblical verses or patriotic symbols, reflecting the deep religious and political sentiments of the time. The presence of a fireback in a colonial home signified not only warmth and comfort, but also a sense of history, tradition, and personal expression. Number 3. The Bible. The Bible held a prominent place in the lives of colonial Americans. More than just a religious text, it was an integral part of their daily routines, beliefs, and values. The Bible's influence extended to various aspects of colonial life, shaping their morals, laws, and social norms. For instance, the Ten Commandments were a cornerstone of colonial legal systems, and biblical stories and parables often served as moral guides for individuals and communities. During religious services, readings from the Bible were central, and its teachings were incorporated into sermons that addressed not just spiritual matters, but also social and ethical issues. The Bible also played a significant role in education. Colonial schools often included biblical teachings in their curriculum, and families regularly read scripture to their children, instilling religious values from an early age. The prominence of the Bible in colonial life reflects the deep religious faith that characterized the era. It was a testament to the belief that religion should permeate all aspects of existence, influencing not only the spiritual journey, but also daily living. Note 2. The pewter plate. Pewter plates were an indispensable part of dining in colonial America. These plates, made from a mixture of tin, antimony, and lead, were valued for their durability, affordability, and resistance to tarnishing. In a time when disposable tableware was non-existent, these plates were used daily, serving a variety of purposes. They were employed for serving meals in colonial taverns and inns, where pewter's durability was essential to withstand the demands of frequent use. At home, pewter plates played a central role in family meals, presenting dishes of various types and sizes. Despite their practicality, pewter plates weren't immune to occasional mishaps. The lightweight yet sturdy nature of pewter meant that while the plates could dent, they were less likely to shatter, making them safer to use compared to their ceramic counterparts. Number 1. The Queen Anne's lace. When you picture the hustle and bustle of daily life in colonial America, you might imagine bustling markets and busy tradesmen. But have you ever stopped to consider the silent heroes of colonial life? Meet the humble Queen Anne's lace, a piece of equipment that might not sound like much, but was actually a critical tool for every colonist. This simple device, basically a glorified pair of tweezers, was used for everything from sewing buttons to mending fences. The Queen Anne's lace was a staple in every toolbox and sewing kit, a testament to its versatility and importance. These humble tools were a must-have for tasks big and small, embodying the resourcefulness and ingenuity that defined colonial life. And there you have it, 10 everyday objects that bring the daily life of colonial Americans to life. Each item tells a story of practicality, resourcefulness, and the ingenuity that defined an era. What did you find most fascinating about these everyday items from colonial America? Let me know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more historical tales. Thanks for joining me on this journey through time. Stay curious, and I'll see you next time.